Welcome to yet another edition of Valley Talk Live. I am still, just like last week, Jeff Crow, joined by
Marcus Ruiz Evans. Hey, Jeff. It's great to be here.
And this week we have got a treat for everybody
Absolutely.
here. One of California's most distinguished congressmen. He's on the line right now, and that would be Congressman Tom McClintock. Welcome, Congressman.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure across the board. Anyhow, just so that folks know, Congressman McClintock was originally from the Simi Valley, Thousand Oaks area. I had to throw that in there, partly for his biography, but also because my family on my dad's side was from down there for many years till we moved up to the Central Valley, Fresno County, and also to a few other states. So, great place to live. Great place to live.
I've had the good fortune of representing the two most beautiful areas of the country. In the state legislature, it was the Channel Islands region, and in Congress, it is the beautiful Sierra.
Yeah, absolutely. With the Simi Valley, Thousand Oaks, Ventura County in general is a great place. It's absolutely a great place. And then where you're at now, South Lake Tahoe, heading down the
Yosemite
mountains.
Valley, Kings Canyon, it doesn't get any better than that.
Oh, for sure. Truly California's gems. The reason why California is what it is when it comes to our geography.
Absolutely.
So anyhow, let's go ahead and just start off, Congressman McClintock, with you introducing yourself to our audience. I'm sure they know a little bit about you, but go ahead and get a little bit into who you are and all the good stuff about the district and whatnot, too.
Well, folks know me. I've been involved in the public policy arena for most of my life, and consistently fought to restore those uniquely American principles of individual liberty and constitutionally limited government and personal responsibility that made this the most prosperous and happy republic in the history of mankind.
Exactly. And did you get started pretty much right out of high school? That's what I understand.
Well, I certainly got interested in politics about then. This was in the early 1970s. They were a tempestuous time in the nation's history, and it was a case of one thing leading to another. I mean, if there's one single epiphany that I had in my life, it was coming home from high school one day and finding my mother in tears over the kitchen table. She'd been figuring out her taxes. She'd just started in real estate and was trying to set aside some extra money to do things for the family, and had discovered that her taxes had taken virtually everything she saved. And that makes a big impression on you when you're a teenager and you come home and find your mom in tears over the kitchen table.
Absolutely.
Well, yeah, absolutely. My just so everybody knows, my grandfather's house actually is not too far from Thousand Oaks High School, which I believe that's where you attended, right?
It was.
All right. Well, yeah, that's, again, nice place, beautiful place. In California, beautiful place. Unfortunately, we have very dysfunctional political situations here, political problems here. And just to start this off, what do you think happened? How do you think California went from this land of milk and honey, the Golden State, somewhere where everybody wanted to go to and move to from all over this country in the 50s, 60s, even into the 70s, into what we see now with these issues and problems that we have now in this state?
Well, you remember I ran against Arnold Schwarzenegger in 2003 for governor, and the point that I raised at every opportunity was that California had not been struck down by some mysterious act of God. If you look at the census data, even back then, and it's accelerated since then, we've seen a huge population exodus out of this beautiful state of California. with all of the blessings that God could give a land, I mean, with the most bountiful resources in the entire continent, the most equitable climate in the entire hemisphere, we're sitting there on the Pacific Rim, poised in a position to literally dominate world trade over the next century, and yet people are finding a better place to live and work and raise their families in the middle of the Nevada and Arizona deserts, for example. And the point I kept raising, and I still raise it today, no act of God could wreak that much damage on our beautiful state. Only acts of government could do that, and unfortunately they have. The good news is that that's within our power to change whenever we summon the political will to do so. I remember a state a generation ago that had among the lowest taxes in the nation, and yet we had the finest highway system in the world. We had the finest public school system in the country. We were offering a free university education to every Californian who wanted one. We were producing water and electricity so abundantly and so cheaply that many communities didn't bother to measure the stuff. That state is still right under our feet. The only thing that has changed between those days and these is public policy, and we have the opportunity at any time we wish to change things right.
Yes, absolutely. It takes a few things, in my opinion. Obviously, the political will, but the political will comes from the people putting pressure on our politicians to do something before these things get to a crisis level that it's so difficult to deal with that it becomes the proverbial bill that comes in each month to a household that folks don't even want to open up the envelope anymore.
Well, because of skyrocketing electricity prices, skyrocketing water prices, higher and higher taxes. We have one of the heaviest tax burdens in the country. It has crushed enterprise. It's crushed innovation. And we've watched a long, slow, continuing exodus of business and opportunity out of California, bound for states with far lower levels of taxation and regulation. But once again, we've done that to ourselves. We live in a democracy, and that means that we have a 100% guarantee of getting the government that we vote for. And if it turns out to be a government that's not to our liking, that's just nature's way of warning us as a people to be a lot more careful about the votes that we cast. And I think people are starting to realize that, especially in California. I mean, look at the devastation that government regulations have wrought in the Central Valley. When the House Natural Resources Committee met last month in Fresno, 1,000 people turned out to protest the leftist environmental policies that have absolutely decimated the economy of the Central Valley, and most of the folks in that crowd spoke Spanish.
Yes.
Right.
Go ahead, Marcus.
I couldn't agree more, Congressman. Last week we had a Republican candidate for lieutenant governor here in California, Ron Nuring, on, and we asked him the same question. California, and I wrote a book, California's Next Century 2.0, and I'm using that as my source. California has, in order, the worst roads, dams, seaports, airports, levees, government buildings, schools. In all 50 states, it's about 45 or 48 out of 50 states, close to Mississippi. And we also have the worst taxes, 49 out of 50 states. I think New York beats us by a little bit, but we are almost worst in the country. So how come we've had a situation for decades? And I know the period you're talking about, the Golden State era. I read about it. I love history. How come?
Well, I actually lived in that state.
Exactly.
It's real.
Exactly. But so how is it that most people here in California lived through the Golden State era? And for decades, at least 10, 15, maybe 20 years, we've had the worst of all infrastructure, everything it takes to run a society, and the worst taxes, and like you said, corporations leaving and people leaving. And this isn't that this is happening the last year or the last 5 years. This has been going on for over a decade. Why isn't that people, when they remember a time when things worked, and they've just watched things get worse for the last 10, 20 years, how come they haven't woken up? What is it that's going to take to get the California people to realize we really are off on the wrong track? Because I'm looking at this and seeing that it's been this way for at least over 10 to 15 years. So What is it going to take? When are they going to get it? Why haven't they gotten it? How can you have such a horrible situation, be surrounded by it for so long, and not simply have an epiphany?
Well, I think that we may be watching the California electorate, along with the national electorate, go through an epiphany. I remember election night 2012, a lot of long faces at our election night event, and I was trying to look for some ray of hope to share, and it occurred to me there were two things to be optimistic about. Number one, the American people, I said, we're about to get a 4-year graduate-level course in Obamacare and Obamonomics, and at the end of that course, they were bound to be a lot sadder and a lot wiser. And the second ray of hope was this, that the people who have most strongly supported Barack Obama and his policies have been those who have been the most harmed by those policies. Now, think about that. That's a total political disconnect. It cannot last. Sooner or later, people will start to make connections and figure things out. We base our entire form of government on the assumption that when people are actually paying attention and thinking things through, collectively they make very good decisions. And I think that we're starting to see that develop in the polling and in the election results, not only across the country, but also in California. I mentioned that hearing a few weeks ago in Fresno. Remember that a Republican candidate for state senate just a few weeks before that had won an election in a district that is 62% Latino, 51% Democrat, and it elected a Republican candidate for Senate. Look at the huge imbalance of resources in the San Diego area, and yet a Republican was just elected as mayor of San Diego. So I think people are starting to think things through, both at the national level and at the state level. It's now being reflected in the polling, and it's starting to be reflected in the election results.
They've had to eat the stew they've been making for so long, and they don't like the taste.
Or as Lincoln said, the voters are everything. If the voters get their backsides too close to the fire, they'll just have to sit on the blisters a while. It's a painful experience, but it's a learning experience. And at the end of that experience, they emerge sadder and wiser and in time for the next election. And I pray that's what's happening now, because we can't afford to go much farther down the path we're on, both in California and across the country.
Yes, certainly. In California, if you look at just our gubernatorial outcomes, our governor races, we had Pat Brown, and I've seen some of your writings. You used to have a website, I believe, that was about Tom. It was 6-7 years ago. It had to do with Tom McClintock's California. I forgot the name of it, but I recall reading some of your things, and one of them was that under Jerry Brown's dad, we had the old-time tax and spend liberal, but at least with that spending, we have something to show for it. The highways, the infrastructure, the universities. Nowadays, the tax and spend liberal is doing long-term debt and long-term damage for short-term things that we won't see even 5 or so years from now.
Well, yes, and that's because between that era of Pat Brown and the new era of Jerry Brown, we unionized and bureaucratized and centralized the state's service delivery systems to the point where we face the paradox that you just pointed out, among the highest tax burdens in the country and yet one of the lowest levels of service. And you can see that in every field. Let me give you just one example from the Pat Brown and then the Jerry Brown era. Under Pat Brown, we passed the Burns-Porter Act. That was the act that established the state water project. If you do the inflation adjustment, it was about $17 billion in today's money. For that $17 billion, we got 21 dams, 7 million acre-feet of water storage, 7,000 megawatts of the cleanest and cheapest electricity on the planet, and we got 700 miles of aqueduct, the principal part of which is called the Pat Brown Aqueduct. It's the central water delivery system for the state. That's what $17 billion properly spent in today's money would buy. Now, compare that to the to Jerry Brown's Cross Delta facility, which I think is around $14 billion. It adds precisely 0 additional water storage and 0 additional hydroelectricity. Look at the unfinished dams that were begun under the Pat Brown era, and you begin to realize what a different environment we would be in right now, given this drought, if we had simply completed the projects that were already underway. For example, everybody thinks that the mother lode of all water in the western United States is the Colorado River. The Colorado River is a junior sister to the Sacramento. The Sacramento's got more water. The difference is we store 70 million acre-feet on the Colorado, and we only store 10 million acre-feet on the Sacramento. Much of the rest is lost to the Pacific Ocean every year. But just finishing 2 Pat Brown-era projects would more than double the water storage on the Sacramento. One is completing the Shasta Dam. We built the Shasta Dam to an elevation of 600 feet because that's all the water we needed at the time, but it was actually designed to be 800 feet. If we simply completed that extra 200 feet of elevation, that by itself would produce 9 million acre-feet of additional water storage and about 1,300 megawatts of additional electricity. Finishing the Auburn Dam, which was the main construction was done on that in the 1970s. That's the carving of the footing in solid rock, the carving of the diversion tunnels. That's the heavy lifting of the dam construction. That was done in the early 1970s. Completing that project would store enough water to fill and refill Folsom Lake 2.5 times and produce another 800 megawatts of electricity. And by the way, all those billions of dollars we're spending for Sacramento Delta flood protection, those billions of dollars are protecting Sacramento against a 200-year flood. The Auburn Dam by itself would protect the same region against a 400-year flood, and both of those projects should be completed with substantially less than the governor's proposing to spend on this Cross Delta facility. So just on the water issue alone, that will give you a measure of how badly diverted our public policy has been in those years.
Now I know why your political opponents don't like you so much. You make too much darn sense.
Well, we've allowed the lunatic fringe of our society to govern us on a lot of these issues and to make these decisions, and they continue to be made today. I mean, here we are in the middle of one of the worst droughts in recorded history in California, and yet as every person is being told and lectured and hounded and cited to scrimp and save and stretch and ration every drop of water, their government is involved just in the past several weeks of massive water releases, 3,000 acre-feet a day out of the new Malonis Dam. I believe it's 2,000 acre-feet a day out of the Nimbus and Folsom Dams, and about, I think it was 1,000 acres feet of water out of the Goodwin Dam on the Stanislaus, all for the amusement of the fish. While we're being told, don't you dare water your lawn.
Yeah, this is very reminiscent to me of the power crisis. What happened, obviously, then was that, we had some issues with power supply and whatnot during Gray Davis's second term, or leading in, I think, just after the second term. And instead of increasing our power supply or making it where people could be individuals and get into solar, which was emerging at the time, so they could be self-sufficient.
Right.
The point of the government was, and I remember all these PSAs put out by them saying to live uncomfortably, to turn your thermostat up to 90 degrees in Fresno, which is unbearable. You could barely sleep with that kind of a temperature. If it's wintertime, put it down to 40 degrees or something ridiculous so that you freeze if you live in the hills. And Californians, to their credit, did conserve about, I think electricity use was cut by about 10% or so. And that was individuals doing it themselves. Now with this water crisis, we're hearing the same thing, except there's an added point to it. We're hearing the same thing. Conserve water. Rather than putting new water into the system, it's conserve water. And, oh, by the way, President Obama is saying we're going to go ahead and issue, more EBT and food stamps to hard-hit communities and more subsidies to farmers and whatnot. Well, I would rather be a poor man who has no government subsidy but plenty of water and electricity than be somebody who is told you don't have any water but here's millions of dollars. I'd rather drink water, have my water, than be told here's a subsidy.
Well, the point is, droughts are nature's fault. They happen, but water shortages are our fault. We have not built a major reservoir in this state since the New Melones in 1979. As I've already pointed out, we have huge volumes of water we can save simply by completing projects that were already started years ago. And yet the environmental left is lecturing us about tearing down 4 perfectly good hydroelectric dams on the Klamath. You still hear these lunatic ideas to tear down the Hetch Hetchy Dam, which is the principal water source for the San Francisco Bay Area. Now, I will readily admit there's a certain poetic justice in that, but it is absolutely crazy. And you want to know why your electricity prices are soaring, and don't forget, Californians already bear one of the highest electricity prices in the United States. It's because of all of the mandates for wind and solar. Solar in particular. That is not a new technology. We have had photovoltaic technology since it was invented in 1839, and yet in more than 170 years, actually 175 years, of technological advancement and research and development and God knows how many billions of dollars of public subsidies, we have not yet invented a more expensive way of producing electricity than solar power. And yet that's what's mandated into our grid and mandated onto our bills. And that's just the first time you pay for that power. Don't forget, we operate an integrated grid. You've got to constantly match the power that is being drawn off of that grid by putting power onto that grid, or the grid collapses. You may have noticed when the wind drops off, the windmills stop turning. When a cloud passes over a solar array or the sun sets, the solar cells stop producing electricity. In the case of clouds and wind drop-offs, that can occur at a moment's notice, which means in an integrated electricity grid, we've got to constantly have standby power ready to go at a moment's notice to keep the grid from collapsing. How do we do that? Well, principally, we keep these gas turbines running at full speed on ready reserve to replace the power that we could lose at any time through wind and solar. So you're literally paying twice. You pay once for the solar or wind generator, and then you've got to pay for a conventional, reliable backup that is spinning at full speed, ready to switch over in order to support that wind and solar at a moment's notice. And then you pay for it a third time because wind and solar power cannot be transmitted over conventional power lines. You have to build very expensive high-tension lines in order to convey that power, so you actually pay 3 times for the same power. It's nuts.
Yeah, absolutely. In an effort of full disclosure, I have to admit that I have worked in the solar industry, but I am not at all offended in any way by what the congressman is saying, because he is correct. Those of us who have been in the industry or currently are know that too much is expected from us by the left. They think that right now we do have this capability, and I would imagine the wind guys are under this pressure too. They believe that we have this capability to run the entire electrical system just by the sun, and that is not accurate yet. We are not there yet. We are, and I say we because like I said, I've been in the business. We we're expected to make miracles out of a product that is certainly a great product, but is not quite there. And I and many others that I've talked to in the industry, and I know this firsthand because, again, in the industry, we fully say, hey, look, this needs to be integrated far more intelligent. We need to drill for oil. We need to get the resources we're traditionally used to having out of the ground, and the other things, fracking as the left calls it. We need these things still because we can't handle it. Yet the left puts us up there as this industry that is capable of creating miracles. I know firsthand, and I argue with leftists all the time about this issue, that, hey, we are not quite there yet. We can be there in 15 years, 20 years, maybe sooner, but we aren't. Do you understand exactly what I'm saying, Congressman? How they put us up there like that?
And people have got to understand when they say, "Oh, well, don't worry, you can install these things on your roof, and they're very cheap. They'll actually pay you to run the meter backwards." People have got to understand the only reason that works is because of massive public subsidies that are being taken out of your tax bills or taken out of your electricity bills. And if you want to know why your electricity bills keep skyrocketing, it's because this power is being mandated into the mix, rather than allowing consumers to make those choices for themselves and have the market report to them the accurate prices that are involved in these various forms of power.
Amen.
You mentioned fracking. The Saudi oil minister last year said that American fracking is the biggest threat to Saudi Arabia in the world. And in that respect, probably so. If you want to know what an energy-independent America looks like, just look at North Dakota. They've got the lowest unemployment rate in the country. They have a huge economic boom going on, and it's all because of hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling on private land that the federal government has not been able to block. And that's to develop what they call the Bakken Shale Oil Reserve. The Bakken Reserve is estimated at about 2.3 billion barrels of recoverable oil. Now, here in California, with one of the highest unemployment rates in the nation, with a severely depressed economy, we're sitting on the Monterey Shale deposit, which is 15.5 billion barrels of recoverable oil. It's more than 7 times the size of the Bakken Reserve, but the government won't let us touch it. That also is absolutely crazy.
Yeah, I had read that I think you said 15 million barrels was billion was estimated to be. Yeah, at CNN on January 15, 2013, California could be the next oil boom. They estimated that was about nearly half the conventional oil in all of Saudi Arabia. Mm-hmm. And
I mean, you look at American oil reserves, Saudi Arabia is a petroleum pygmy compared to the United States. The only difference is they have developed their resources for the prosperity of their country, and our government specifically blocked Americans from doing the same.
Yes, and then there's an after effect, obviously, with this, and it ties into foreign policy. What ends up happening is these so-called friends of ours in Saudi Arabia end up financing terrorist movements. Most of the 9/11 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia. A couple of princes from Saudi Arabia were tied directly to this situation and terrorism. And the 3 mysteriously died in automobile accidents and things like that, stuff that doesn't normally happen to guys at that level. And so, we see how they have us being forced by our government, like you said, being forced by our government through bad policy and mandates to rely upon foreigners, particularly those that hate us and our values, and they in many other aspects of our society, our culture in particular. it forces us to literally finance the same people. Our own money is being used to come back to get us and attack us.
Full circle.
Well, and again, there's one bit of good news in all this, and that is we've done this to ourselves, and we can change it whenever we summon the political will. You know, Drudge today carried the news that China's economy is about to eclipse ours as the biggest in the world. It just breaks my heart. I had a conversation with a Chinese businessman last year who was kind of bragging about it, and he says, you know, you Americans, you have an import-export problem. For the last 30 years, you've been exporting capitalism and you've been importing socialism. And once again, just taking great glee that we had done this to ourselves. Why do we put up with this? Why do we put up with these people in office that have done this to us? I don't understand that. But again, maybe the answer is that people are starting to realize this damage and starting to resolve to do something about it. And that's why we cast votes in every election. That's how we change public policy.
Right. And in fact, the recall election that you mentioned before is a prime example of that. When the left goes too far, and unfortunately it sometimes has to do that, the people bounce back and do something. Now, at the time, Arnold Schwarzenegger, you know, he obviously changed and became what I call a political chameleon after that. But at the time of the actual recall election, he ran under the banner of fiscal conservatism.
Oh, you bet. He was a rock-ribbed Reagan Republican, a disciple of free enterprise guru Milton Friedman. You know, he was going to reduce the tax and regulatory burdens. You know, he ran as an economic conservative of the highest order. And you know, I had one consolation in that race. That was one where people were paying attention. They were listening to each of the candidates. And in the final LA, actually in every single poll that was done, LA Times, Gallup, Field, PPIC, I ended with the highest approval rating. In other words, people thought I was the best qualified to be governor, but we couldn't translate into votes, and and that was frustrating. But between the two of us, Schwarzenegger and I took over 60, I believe it was 62% of the vote combined.
That's what I was about to say, yes.
Which means, you know, because I mean, the one thing I couldn't get around was, oh, well, yes, McClintock's the best qualified, but Arnold's a good conservative too, and Arnold can win and McClintock can't. But the fact of the matter, and there are so few Republicans left in California, we don't dare split up the vote, or Cruz Bustamante, the Democrat, will be elected. And as it turns out, Schwarzenegger and I together running as fiscal Reagan Republicans took 62% of the vote. Bustamante took 31%. You could have sliced. You could have divided the Republican vote any way you liked. The Republicans still would have won.
Yes, absolutely, Congressman, and that's and I also had looked at the stats, especially back then, but I reviewed them in every demographic group, because that ties into another thing that's going on today that Republicans are questioning themselves. Certain ones are about getting this block or that block. Well, between the two of you, you guys got, I believe, 20% or so of the African American vote. I believe you got almost half, 45%. It was a very high amount of the Latino vote, and the message was very sellable. You did a very good job, I remember, during the debate of selling the message. Arnold had a bit of the, I guess you could say, the personality. You have great personality too, so don't get me wrong, Congressman. But
well, I never could hold a candle to Arnold. The tragedy of Arnold was, having been elected as a rock-ribbed Reagan Republican, he then turns around and does exactly the opposite of what he promised, and the Republicans got blamed.
Correct, exactly, and so, but the point being is that before that, you would have seen maybe 9% of the black vote. You may have seen about 33%, I think, of the Latino vote in California. The numbers that for you guys to move the pendulum like that together was phenomenal. And you didn't have to do anything other than state your case.
Well, yeah. In fact, in the L.A. Times exit poll, they reported that most of my votes came from non-Republicans. So it's a message that sells across party lines. I mean, that's what Ronald Reagan was talking about in '76 when we said we've got to paint our positions in bold colors and not hide them in pale pastels. Freedom works. And the American founders didn't call them self-evident truths for nothing. It helps to point them out to people, but when you do, they get it. And it doesn't matter whether they're a Democrat or a Republican or any one of the third-party candidates. The fact of the matter is freedom works, and hopefully people are beginning to realize we have drifted far from those principles. If we will simply return to them, we can restore the kind of prosperity and liberty and happiness that this nation knew for most of its 225 plus years.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think today, one of the guys in the U.S. Senate that I look to, and I kind of look at you in the House and a few others, and then in the Senate, Rand Paul. When I want to see an issue and new ways of selling a message, outreach, new ways of pointing out the Constitution, because I think all of you guys in this group that I have of who I listen to when I want to hear what's going on from a constitutional standpoint, you guys make the Constitution. You show how relevant it is, and with Senator Rand Paul, he's doing that outreach. He's doing a lot of things to sell this message, and when it's presented properly, and not just in a watered down way or a bland way or a real boring way, when it's said in a proper way, you don't have to change who you are. You just have to point out. A lot of it today is voter education. I think, unfortunately, America's been dumbed down. What's your comments on that?
Well, I don't think that's the case. I think that it's a pattern that you see in democracies when things are going reasonably well or even reasonably poorly. People don't pay a lot of attention to politics because they've got a lot of other things going in their lives. That's not apathy. That's just the process of getting up in the morning, getting the kids ready for school, getting to work on time, picking up the kids, getting to soccer practice, dropping off the laundry, stopping at the grocery store, getting the kids home, making dinner, throwing a load of laundry in, and starting all over again the next morning. I mean, there's a lot that people are occupied with, and if they don't have to pay attention to politics, they don't. And that's why democracies will tend to drift off course from time to time. But as they drift farther and farther off course, individual citizens begin to realize that their country's drifting into danger, that things are getting bad enough that they themselves, as individual citizens, have to do something. They start spending enormous amounts of time and attention on the public policy questions and understanding them and casting informed votes and in setting things right. And I think that we are on the eve of such a development in our country today. I mean, you mentioned Rand Paul. I mean, that guy gets standing ovations at both Tea Party meetings and at UC Berkeley student meetings. Now that's quite an accomplishment. But if you listen to what he's saying, it is the American founding principles. And whether it's the IRS intimidation of Tea Party groups for their political beliefs, or whether it is the NSA spying on millions of Americans in direct violation of the Fourth Amendment, people are beginning to realize their liberty is on the line, their prosperity is on the line, and they better do something about it. I've often pointed out, if you look at all of the laws that are passed under our Constitution, we have an elaborate armed enforcement mechanism for those laws. You break any of them, sooner or later a police officer is going to show up with a gun. But if you break the Constitution, nothing happens. There is no such enforcement mechanism. Why is that? It's because the Constitution was designed to be self-enforcing. It's all the checks and balances that we learned about in school. But in order for that to work, the powers have got to be evenly divided. The people who exercise those powers must be devoted to the Constitution. But the most important thing of all, this only works if one condition is met, and that is if the American people insist on it, and we insist on it through the votes we cast. That's how we defend our Constitution. And if we ever stop defending it with our votes and insisting that the people who we send to office are devoted to that Constitution, we will lose it, and we will lose the prosperity and the liberty that it guarantees.
Yeah, and I'm going to throw one thing in and then throw this back to Marcus. Speaking of this, and I'm glad you transitioned into this area, obviously this president came in and created way more czars. I think we had one czar at the time, the drug czar. He created a czar for almost everything. And since then, he has pretty much gone out of his way to executive order almost anything he can. And, you know, one of the things that Senator Paul, and he changed me on this view because he made me see this from a constitutional viewpoint versus what we were led to believe. He was talking about the war on drugs in general, and he wasn't promoting drugs by any means, but he was promoting the Constitution and promoting our values. And one of the things that he said was that the federal government has traditionally never had the authority to regulate intrastate commerce. So if somebody is using, let's say, a plant that they grow in their own yard or whatever for medicinal use or whatever, it was never the right of the federal government to intervene in it, and vice laws in general, whether they be gambling, whether they be alcohol regulation, tobacco regulation, whatever it is. They've always been the purview of the states. And he pointed out, because everybody thinks Republicans are trying to throw everybody in prison and yada, yada, yada. He pointed out that it was actually progressives like Woodrow Wilson, and then later with FDR, 1937, he passed what was called the Marijuana Tax Act, and that was the first federal marijuana law. Before that, we had a states' rights system. And this states' rights system actually worked. We had a far, far reduced use rate. We had, for those who were addicted, we did what is now considered unfashionable, I guess, or politically incorrect. We actually turned these folks back to God. We turned them back to their Creator to deal with these issues. And and some states had prohibition, others didn't, and it was just a matter of you lived wherever your values were, and that we in the process of the progressives, and they love to talk about how they're for rights and freedoms and this and that. They created a system that is clogging our prisons now. It's created a system where the federal government has used it as an empowerment tool for themselves when it comes to enforcement, and now it's bleeding over to other areas of liberty.
The powers of government were divided by the American founders both horizontally and vertically. We learned all of that. Hopefully, we learned all of that in grade school. But on the vertical side, you're absolutely right. The federal government was supposed to be one of specifically enumerated powers. Ronald Reagan put it best when he said the Constitution is not the government's document telling the people what we can and cannot do. The Constitution is the people's document telling our government those things that we will allow it to do. We empowered that federal government. One of its enumerated powers is to regulate interstate commerce between the states. And the reason for that was they didn't want states imposing tariffs on American commerce. They wanted the federal government to have supremacy when goods were crossing between states. But they never allowed or intended that the federal government would regulate commerce within the states. Well, throughout the 20th century, those divisions were gradually broken down to the point where the federal government now asserts supremacy over all commerce under the most fictional of pretenses. But even more dangerous is of the disintegration of the horizontal separation of powers between the branches of government. We are now entering an era when the president is asserting the authority to pick and choose what laws he'll enforce and what laws he'll ignore, to pick and choose who has to obey those laws and who can ignore them, and he's now asserting the authority to enact laws through the regulatory bureaucracies that the Congress has specifically refused to enact. This is unprecedented, at least for America. It's not unprecedented in human experience. Edward Gibbon, looking at the collapse of the Roman Republic, said that when the executive authority is allowed to usurp the legislative authority, the Constitution and liberty are forfeit. And we're now entering such a period unless we, the people, through the votes that we cast, insist that the next Congress and the next president are actually devoted to the constitutional principles that keep us free.
Yes, go ahead, Marcus. We've got about 11 minutes left or so.
I was looking over one of your speeches, Congressman. I think it was on My Motherlode on 12/19/2013 by Mark Trupner. And it was talking about a speech that you gave towards I think, December 2013. And literally, the parts that I liked best, you just named. The rot began long before this administration, but under this administration, it has become a crisis. The Constitution makes very clear that only Congress may make laws, and that the principal responsibility of the executive is to take care of those laws, that those laws be faithfully executed. Yet, the executive has increasingly asserted sweeping powers to unilaterally nullify laws that it dislikes, to pick and choose who must obey the law and who need not, and even to impose entirely new laws that Congress has explicitly refused to act. How did we get to this point where it seems that we are allowing a piling up of power on just one of the pillars of our government, mostly in the executive? And people seem to be fine with that. I remember when George W. Bush was passing the Patriot Act and enacting wars, people were upset. Oh, that's a lot of power for the president. And then when Barack Obama does it, I just don't see any protests. And yet legally, it's the same thing. I decide to launch a war. I decide to take over more rights. Where's the upset part of the American public? Are they not getting it? Do they not recognize that you can't keep piling powers on one specific arm of government and expect to have balance? At some point, you approach something that doesn't look like a republican and looks more like a dictatorship. Are people seeing that? Are they waking up? Why aren't they seeing that?
Time will tell. I think they are seeing it. I'm seeing a lot of folks that have never been involved in public policy or go to public meetings suddenly are showing up, and I think the reason is because they do sense that something's wrong. They might not be able to put their finger on it yet, but they understand this country is seriously off track. Gallup in January reported that 66%, a record high, 66% of the American people now believe that the federal government is too big and too powerful. Now, that's a profound thing. When two-thirds of the American people can agree on anything, that's a pretty profound development. And the fact that they agree that this federal government has grown too big and too powerful tells me that they are setting the stage for a revival of these constitutional principles that were designed to keep the federal government in check, to allow it the authority that it needs to protect our freedom without acquiring so much power that it becomes destructive of those freedoms. And you mentioned the regulatory bureaucracies. Think about this. The American founders painstakingly divided the powers of government. And they did that for a very important reason, because we human beings tend to be a little bossy. We really like it when people do what we tell them to, and we really like it when we're left alone to do as we please. How do you create a government to be administered, as Madison said, by human beings, by flawed human beings, that are going to are going to control themselves when they are loaned power over their fellow human beings. How do you do that? Well, you divide up those powers so that one organ makes the decisions, but an entirely separate organ carries them out, and an entirely separate organ from those two actually adjudicates them. But now think about what this trend toward the regulatory state has produced. The agencies are now making laws, and in fact, the rule-making of the federal bureaucracies is now 10 times greater than the volume of laws actually passed by the Congress.
Wow.
If you run afoul of those laws, they are enforced by the same branch, and when you get hauled before court, you get hauled before a regulatory court. There was a constitutional scholar that came before a congressional committee about 6 weeks ago who pointed out you now have 10 times the likelihood of being hauled before an administrative regulatory court than to be hauled before a federal court where you have your due process rights. So all of the three basic powers of government that the founders painstakingly separated out to protect our freedom have now been recombined within these executive agencies, and they are running amok.
Yeah, very clearly they are running amok in all areas, and they've in our personal lives and in our ability to earn income and be prosperous, start up businesses, whatever. It seems like they've gotten in the way, and they continue to do it more and more and more. And I think that pretty much what's happening is that there's temporary comfort that comes from, let's say, a government check to people, whereas when somebody actually gets a position in a company, starts a company, and it makes good money for them, that's where the long-term benefit, long-term feelings of satisfaction come from, and I think we need to get back to that. Now, Congressman, we've got 5 minutes left. We'll go over another issue or two. Let's get some info out there about how can people help you out? How can they get a hold of you so that you can, win your election?
Well, my campaign website is tommcclintock.com, or if you prefer, helptom.com. Either way will get you there, but tommcclintock.com. That's got all of the speeches that I've given. I post all of my votes on the website. I try to post the reasons for the important votes, and you can also volunteer to help.
Okay, and do you have any events coming up here in the district, or anything that's coming up fairly soon, or whatnot?
I sure do, but I don't have the schedule here in front of me. So
Okay.
we do publish that both on my campaign site from time to time and also my official site.
Yet another reason, folks. Go to tommcclintock.com, or an easier one to remember would be helptom.com. And just so you guys know, the situation that this congressman is in has to do with California's change in the primary system, where the top two vote getters, no matter what party, go to the November election. And what has happened, in my opinion, and I think this is shared amongst anybody who's educated, is that somebody wants Congressman McClintock out. Maybe not say his name offhand, but I think that anybody who's studied it knows who I'm referring to. And so what they did was they put a Republican, in a nominal Republican, we'll say, up, and all of a sudden the Democrats drop out of the race. So now the congressman is forced to fight for a seat that should be a seat that I don't use the word entitled to, but a seat that he is very well matched for politically, his views and
first of
whatnot.
all, I don't mind fighting for my seat. I like what Churchill once said. He said, I fight for my corner and I leave when the pub closes. That's not the problem. The problem with this new system is that it can be easily manipulated to produce results that a straight-out election would never do. And what we're seeing is, in this case, the mysterious withdrawal of candidates from the Democratic Party to manipulate the field that people have to choose from. We've seen some other districts where phantom candidates file, not with any intention of campaigning or running, but calculated to split up the vote, again, to manipulate the field. But I think that the worst thing about this new system is that it destroys third parties.
Yes.
As a practical matter, you've got no chance of having a third party on the ballot. So if you don't like the choices you have, well, there is no choice after that. You get a choice between two candidates in November, and if you don't like that, tough. I think we've all had a situation where we didn't like the candidates that the Republicans and the Democrats were offering, and we had a plethora of third-party candidates we could choose from. That choice has now been taken away from us. And the other thing about the third parties is, as annoying as they are to Republicans and Democrats, they raise the issues that Republicans and Democrats often don't want to raise.
Yes.
But they ought to be part of that mix, and they've been frozen out of the system. So that's what I object to, is the manipulation of the field to produce results that a straight-out election would not. And secondly, that silencing the third parties, which sometimes raise points that the other parties, that the major parties won't do, and we need that in our system. That's the food for thought from an election to an election.
I can't agree more. It doesn't make sense to me how this state is about diversity, being super diverse, open to new ideas, and then when it comes to our political system, we say, well, let's not have diversity or new ideas. That's just anathema to being a Californian.
Exactly. We're down to our just under a minute left. Again, I'd like to remind folks, TomMcClintock.com, also HelpTom.com, and we certainly would love to have the congressman back on again. If you don't mind joining us again, we certainly would love having you, Tom.
I'd love to do it anytime. Just give me a holler.
Oh, absolutely. Great interview. It felt like a conversation. It really did. This hour has gone by quicker than any hour that we've had in quite some time. So anyhow, again, folks, Tom McClintock. What's the district? Is it the 4th district?
It's the 4th congressional district. It runs from Lake Tahoe all the way through Yosemite and on to Kings Canyon in Fresno County.
Okay, great. We will see you guys next week. We are out.